Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Darian Duncan, and this is the second conversation in our Mobilize series for 2023. And it's called Moving Together, Mass Transit and Mass Mobility. So we're going to start off by introducing our presenter for today and move into their presentation, and then get into a very exciting discussion with our fellow panelists, followed by audience Q&A. So if throughout the course of the presentation you have any questions or comments or ideas, please feel free to start putting them in the chat. I'm going to try our best to get towards all of them at the end. So for the Mobilize series, we are exploring the ways and the means in which we get around our cities and our communities here in the Caribbean. So a supermajority of residents in the Kingston Metropolitan area do not own cars nor use them as their primary mode of transportation. Despite this, the infrastructure that makes up our transportation network is specifically designed to advance car use over all other alternatives. So with a transportation system that is distinctly car dependent and lacks alternatives, getting around the city is a major source of frustration for us all. So whether you drive, whether you take the bus or you walk, moving through our cities is any combination of expensive, unpredictable, time-consuming, and increasingly more dangerous. So the Mobilize series aims to really explore how peer cities are transforming their transportation systems to be more efficient, to be more safe, and to be more equitable for all. So my name, as I said earlier, is Darian Duncan. I'm one of the founders of Island City Lab. For those of you who are new to our programming, we are a Kingston-based urban planning think tank dedicated to understanding the unique features and challenges of small island cities in the Caribbean. Our aim is really to improve our built environments by building and fostering and convening a network of civic thinkers to confront the challenges. And this forum is a part of that program. So today I'm very excited to say that we have a very regional conversation with our presenter being from Colombia and panelists from Jamaica and from Trinidad and Tobago. So I'm going to introduce our main presenter. Carlos Cadena is a PhD. He's a multi-award winning sustainability expert and former video. But Carlos is a PhD, multi-award winning sustainability expert, former transport commissioner of Medellin, Colombia. He's a full member of the state of Antiochia's scientific committee for the climate crisis, the former consultant for the Inter-American Development Bank and UN Habitat, PhD alumnus of UNU Merit, and program alumnus of the Reinhardt College, the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies, the Harvard Kennedy School as well. So Carlos is a regular media contributor in the national press and TV on urban sustainability, transportation, and innovation. He's an assistant professor at ESET University in Medellin, Colombia, multiple NGO founder and proven fundraiser with partners at Oxford University, among others. He's passionate about cycling, the arts, and achieving real-world impact through world-class research. So I'm going to hand it over to Carlos for his presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Doreen. Let me see if you can see my slides. And if so, I'll start. I am so honored and grateful with Island City Lab and with all of you for allowing me to share some ideas today. Please feel free to contact me at any time if you think I can provide advice, assistance on any of your projects or initiatives. I am based out of Medellin, Colombia, and in fact, I will also share mostly ideas about what we have achieved in Medellin, Colombia. It'll be a short presentation, but I look forward to the debate, and I look forward to any of the questions you may have either during this webinar or later on via social media or email. I'd also like to say warm regards to my colleagues today. Medellin is in Colombia. I'm sure you notice that we are close neighbors thanks to a Caribbean, and Metropolitan Medellin must be considered as one of the main variables, because one of the issues that we ought to discuss more frequently is that cities not necessarily exist as islands. Cities have a lot to do with the metropolitan contexts and the regional contexts. And for example, Medellin is only one municipality out of 10 municipalities that compose the metropolitan area of Medellin. This is incredibly important for our context, because it means that we have at least 10 city governments that jointly ought to take decisions, either for transport or for education or for health. And these 10 municipalities are part of the same region that we call Antioquia. This is a real picture from Medellin. I'm sure it's not very different from many of the roads in your hometowns and or countries. This is something that we struggle with day by day, and that unfortunately will probably continue to grow as a challenge. And as context, I also want to share with you this idea. In the left side of the screen, you can see my neighborhood in 1977. In the right side of the screen, you can see my neighborhood, the same picture, pretty much the same picture in 2013. We are in 2023 now, and it only has continued to grow. This means huge challenges for urban transport. All of this happens during the context of our climate crisis. We hear about this every day, everywhere, but it is hugely important, because transport has a lot to do with the climate crisis, and cities have a lot to do with the climate crisis. Not just because of the fact that the ways in which we move around our cities determine in a certain way this changes in our climate during the last decades, but also because we have to plan ahead in what will become immense challenges due to global warming, but also due to climate risk in our countries, our cities, and particularly our roads. With that in mind, then, the location of Colombia, of Medellin, the fact that we are a metropolitan city composed by minimum 10 municipalities, and the fact that we live in the context of a climate crisis, I'd like to start this discussion with why Medellin is important for you in Jamaica or Trinidad and Tobago or elsewhere in the Caribbean or elsewhere in the global south. Medellin used to be the most dangerous city in the world in the 1990s. It unfortunately ranked as the most dangerous city in the world in 1991 due to the number of deaths and homicides. And this is a story that we are not very proud of, but that we have managed to transform into something completely different. So we are very proud of the city that we have been building together during the last decades, that we continue to transform and mold every day. In the last decade, Medellin has been awarded numerous prizes around the world, mostly due to its urban transformation, things related to the social impact of our urban transformation, things related to the environmental impact of our urban transformation, and definitely things related to the transformation around transport and how transport serves social and environmental purposes, apart from the obvious economic impacts that a better transport system has in every city around the world. So if you have not heard this story yet, in one sentence, I could probably summarize it by saying that Medellin used to be the most dangerous city in the world in 1991, and it is today one of the most awarded cities around the world, thanks to the urban transformations that we have accomplished together. I'd like to start sharing some ideas about why transport has been such an important variable in Medellin. This is the map that includes the mass transport system for the city of Medellin. Right in the center of the screen, you can see the blue line that references the river, the Medellin River, which crisscrosses the metropolitan Medellin from south to north. And around it, you can see the many different lines of mass transport system that we have in our city. They are integrated both physically and also in terms of the tariff, in terms of the tickets, and they are coordinated by one single entity. This single entity is what we call the Medellin Metro. It goes without saying that we feel very proud of our metro system, and even today, even though Medellin is not the capital of Colombia, the capital city in Colombia is Bogota, a massive, fantastic city. Even today, Medellin is the only city in Colombia that has a metro system. So that also needs to be kept in mind for the debate and the questions later on. But then look at this. It's a very diverse system in which Medellin has been pioneering urban and transport solutions for the rest of the world, not just the global south. In this picture, you can see one of those solutions, the cable cars, the Medellin cable car system, which, as I mentioned earlier, is directly connected to the Medellin Metro. This means that you have direct access from the metro station to the cable cars, and that you need not pay, you don't have to pay additional money in order to access the cables. They are directly linked, as if you were changing from one metro line in Paris to another metro line in Paris. In this picture, you can also see one of the most fantastic and real issues related to Medellin. This cable car system is able to access the most peripheral neighborhoods in our city. Our city is a beautiful, beautiful city in the Andes, but also it means that the city is completely surrounded by steep slopes from the Andes mountains, which is, of course, another challenge to urban transport and mass transport. We have been able to join this system with specific solutions that work well in slopes, such as those in the city of Medellin. In this picture, you can see the well-functioning tramway in the eastern side of the city. This tramway line is a very special line because it uses the pneumatic tires, such as those that a normal car would have, similar to those that a normal car would have. They are, of course, hidden in the carcass of the tramway. But this pneumatic tires allow for this tramway to be able to use very high slopes and be able to manage to go high up in the mountains. It's a very well functioning tramway. The tramway and the VRT system that you can see in the picture share another specific idea that we have been, I guess, contributing to the discussions in the rest of the global south from Medellin. And it has to do with the distribution of public space. Medellin, like many other cities around the world, around the Caribbean, around South America, is a city where public space is extremely scarce. Road space is extremely scarce. So decision makers, such as myself, when I served as transport secretary for the city of Medellin, have a tough challenge, and it is to decide what to do with the very, very scarce space for roads. Normally, as it has happened during the last 50 to 60 years in our region, space has been in an unfair and unjust way distributed mostly for motorcycles and cars. That means individual transport. What Medellin and many other cities around the world have been leading is the idea that scarce road space ought to be distributed with a priority for public transport, for the tramway that you are seeing in your screen right now, and for systems such as the BRT, bus rapid transit, which means that buses and tramways that are able to transport many more people per square meter ought to be given priority in the system, in the road system for a city. Individual transport, of course, provides the additional challenge that if every person drives around a city, one person per car, no matter if it is a diesel powered car or an electricity powered car, very soon road space will be congested. Therefore, tramways and BRT systems such as those in the picture compose one of the additional very important decisions in the system of Medellin, Metropolitan Medellin. This is a picture of our metro system. Our metro system works extremely well. We've been using this system for 25 years already, more than 25 years. It's a very loved system in our city, and it also has contributed with an additional variable for cities in the global south. It is a matter of pride. It is a source of pride for the locals to have a well-functioning metro system. Therefore, people like your hosts at Island City Lab, who have studied in depth the case of Medellin and many other visitors to our city, have been able to see that there is never a piece of garbage in the metro system in Medellin, that people always behaved in a very civic way in our metro system in Medellin. The most common example is that as soon as you see a person with a baby or a toddler or a pregnant woman entering the system, you will always see that somebody will stand up and provide that chair to that person. This is unbelievable if you hear it for the first time, but an absolute reality when you live it, visiting Medellin. I hope you get to visit Medellin. I'm about to finish with my slides. I would also like to share some maps that provide additional insights into what our system looks like. As I mentioned in my introduction, Medellin is composed of at least 10 municipalities that we call Metropolitan Medellin. And you can see in this slide that if you provide access around at least 500 meters around each node of what we call the mass transport nodes in our city, the quantity of citizens in Metropolitan Medellin that would have direct access, what we call walkable access to mass transport, is immense. If you increase the access around the accessibility around those nodes by at least 2 kilometers, which would imply that we are talking about access via bicycle in order to access via bicycle a mass transport node. Pretty much the complete city of Metropolitan Medellin is accessible by mass transport. That is an immense possibility for cities such as Medellin in the global south. Thus, cycling continues to be a big question in Medellin. We are one of the only cities in Colombia that has working and free public access bicycle scheme. This bicycle scheme is called Encicla, and it is widely available in the city of Medellin. We have had some issues with the system in the recent years, and we continue to have challenges in promoting that the system is also available in the rest of the municipalities that I have mentioned earlier in my presentation. It continues to be a challenge for Medellin. But I guess the biggest challenge for Medellin also has to do with topography. In this slide, you can see that Medellin is a city surrounded by mountains. In the blue and yellow colors, you can see easily accessible locations in metropolitan Medellin by bicycle. That means flat land. In the red colors, you can see what we call the slopes or the mountains surrounding the city, and thus either you are a very powerful cyclist, and I'm proud to say that I am one of those, and or you ought to use electric cycling assistance, which is by now a very well developed technology all around the world. So even though topography from the first perspective for cities such as Medellin continues to be a challenge, many of us think that electric assistance and or well-designed infrastructure and well developed road space allocation will provide for more cycling usage in Medellin. Finally, we have also open discussions around the use of electric escalators. You can see the electric escalators right in the center of the picture, where we have been able to provide public free-to-use electric escalators in neighborhoods high up in the slopes, such as this neighborhood in Medellin, and or the discussions are about how walking the city should always be the most prized mode in the city. This low emissions zone right in the center of the city was one of the public policy initiatives that I was proud to lead in the city of Medellin, and it will probably continue to grow as the years go by. This is one of pictures where you can see, for example, the before and after of the same space, the same road in the low emissions zone in the center of the city, where we think that road allocation should be primarily provided for walking, and then to cycling, and then to public transport, as I mentioned in one of my initial slides. That was all for me today, and I'm looking forward to any discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Thank you so much for that. I mean, I think what was exciting about your presentation and the story of Medellin is really thinking about public transportation as being critical for social transformation. I think these are things that we talk about a lot, especially in Kingston, and I imagine also still in Port of Spain. But thinking about transportation as being kind of essential to changing the society and changing the material conditions of people is, you know, I think where we need to be having these conversations, kind of aspirational, right? I also appreciated you talking about the diversity of the transport system in Medellin, and that for each of these different problems you mentioned terrain, kind of social hierarchy, all these different technical things that transportation officials have to figure out, that there's a technology solution for all of them, right? So I'm going to bring on my, esteemed panelists. Before I hand it over to them to kind of get into conversation, I want to kind of read their, quick bio. So first we have Miss Carla Barrett, who currently manages the service planning department at the Jamaica Urban Transit Company, which is a state-owned bus company which provides public transit service in the Kingston Metropolitan Transportation Region. So she has served the company for over 15 years in this capacity, as well as the transport planner and route and system planning supervisor. Ms. Bart holds a Bachelor's of Science in Urban and Regional Planning and a Master's degree in Business Administration. And now we have Catherine Agong, and I'm going to ask Jordan to pin both of these panelists as well. Catherine is the go-to expert for transportation planning and transportation engineering in Trinidad and Tobago. She is a researcher at the Faculty of Engineering and the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at UA in Trinidad, and recently appointed as the expert in transportation under the National Planning Authority. So she brings her skills in problem solving to public and private organizations, expertly untangling traffic and transport conundrums with her analytical technique, right? So we're gonna unpack some conundrums here, right? So I'm gonna hand it over to you first, Carla. I think because it's such a regional conversation, 3 different countries here, I'd like you to kind of contextualize the issues happening in Kingston. So if you could list the top 3 specific issues that are hindering the provision of mass transit in Kingston, what would it be?
Conundrum is quite a fitting word, because I think answering that question, it is actually quite a conundrum. And of course, this is debatable. Persons would perhaps have different opinions, but I'm sure pretty much all the issues that persons will come up with are intertwined and interlinked. So for me, in my opinion, it's the never-ending story in developing countries of limited resources and competing priorities. And unfortunately, in my experience, for the most part, I don't see where public transportation and mass transit has necessarily been a high priority item over the years. And so, from time to time, there are particular areas that are focused on, but in a holistic way, I don't see where public transit in a holistic and in a national way has ever really been very high on the priority listing when it comes to the competing priorities. And so that's a big factor for me. One of the issues in Kingston also relates to, so it's mass transit almost always versus the smaller private vehicle operators. And the frank reality of it is that the private vehicle operators providing transportation services also a means of employment for a lot of persons. And so the political will, I find, to thrust all or more into mass transit, which would mean mopping up and eradicating some of these private vehicle operators, that will just isn't there to do that, because that would affect your employment statistics. And then, and some of this was mentioned in the presentation just now, it's just the whole socio-cultural context where public transit, I find, is considered the means of transportation for the poor. And so unfortunately, and this is not necessarily the case in first world countries, but in developing countries, sometimes it is viewed that way. And so it doesn't get the type of emphasis that I think it should get some of the times. And so we find that development tends to favor private vehicle operations over persons using mass transit and over pedestrian movement. And I think we fail to understand that linkage between mass transit and economics, mass transit and mobility in your city generally as it relates to, traffic congestion. I think we fail to see the linkage. So those are the 3 areas that I find are restrictive for us.
Mm-hmm. Catherine, is the situation any different in Port of Spain? Are those the same three issues for you as well? Or are they different?
It's the same. I mean, Carla like went into my head and took the words out and said the same things. Port of Spain exactly the same issues. But what I will focus on then, apart from those that Carla mentioned, is the fact that on a more granular level, there's some things that are needing to be sorted out to facilitate the movement from private vehicle use to mass transit in Port of Spain. One, we need some really solid network planning professionals. The transport planning numbers, the people who specialize in that are very, very, very small in Trinidad and Tobago, and we can't do all of the work. So that's one thing, the capability for doing efficient network planning is not there, in my opinion. Secondly, we have a peculiar situation where some of the mass transit vehicles or some of the vehicles that might be suitable for mass transit are legally prohibited from entering downtown Port of Spain. And that, like Carla indicated, helps, proliferate private transport use because people can't get to where they really need to be because you only have the options of using your private car or using a taxi, which again, sometimes they don't have the network penetration necessary to get people where they need to be in 2023. So legally, things need to be untangled and untied as well to make them fit for purpose where we want to be for mass transit. And thirdly, whilst there's some really good transport planning projects happening in isolated areas, in Port of Spain, there is no real overarching transport policy to guide what should be planned for and what should be implemented and to help, I guess, politicians to see where funding needs to be allocated. So without that, there's a bit of a struggle to get to where we need to be for mass transit to be a viable option inside of Port of Spain, including Greater Port of Spain.
Yeah. I mean, I think the two of you mentioned something that's very interesting, right? And for context, for those of you who are not from Jamaica, I think early on this year, the taxi operators had a strike, and that strike effectively shut down the entire city for a period of about 3 days, right? So to what Carla mentioned and what Catherine mentioned, the kind of proliferation of smaller, less efficient transit options, aka taxis or minibuses, they're a very real sort of competition for mass transit. I want Carlos to kind of come in and comment on that as well. But I'm going to hand it over to Catherine first, right? Because the level of competition exists there where, taxis, the maxi taxis in Trinidad, they are, and even right now, even ride sharing apps as well. If those alternatives have better frequency, that means they're driving along the route faster than, say, the bus, and they have better access. So they're going deeper into people's communities. What do you think, what type of policies or support do you need for public transportation to become more efficient, to compete with these alternatives?
Like Carlos mentioned in his presentation, what they've done is facilitate movement from, I guess, the more, how should I say it? The areas further away from the main mass transit route. They facilitated that by providing free bicycle, and I think the tram cars, you said, Carlos, so provided free so you can get to the main route. I think that is something that is very sorely lacking in the approach that we take to transport planning. We, not in Port of Spain, but outside of Port of Spain, we have our lovely, beautiful, award-winning, if awards are available at the time that it was implemented, our priority bus route, which it's a road. Remember, I showed you that, Doreen, once we had a discussion. It's for the benefit of the people who are not in Trinidad and Tobago. It is a road from Port of Spain, downtown Port of Spain, all the way to the east of the country. And that 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 carries buses and maxi taxis. And the thing about it is that without the facilitating of walking, we're a bit further away of cycling than I guess Colombia is, because again, there's a skills gap where cycling is concerned, in my opinion, and a safety constraint where cycling is concerned. To maximize the use of the priority bus route, you would have to implement transport measures to get people to make it more efficient, viable. And the same applies in parts of Port of Spain as well.
Okay. Carla, thoughts on policies to make buses more competitive?
Right. I definitely agree with Catherine. That is something that is lacking. And again, it comes back to that whole holistic look at how we plan for transportation, because these smaller vehicles, they do have a place, but what we have seen is just an allowance of everybody to be everywhere. And so hence the competition, when in reality, mass transit cannot go everywhere. So there is an opportunity for the smaller vehicles on the peripherals and in the areas that the mass transit vehicles can go to, bring persons to a point and have, the modes connect. But we don't actually have that. And so we just have this, never-ending competition. Outside of that, though, there definitely are, some areas, a lot of areas that need to be tightened up in terms of operational efficiencies and management of or mass transit operations in Kingston that would see us providing a more reliable service. Because, over the years being at JUTC, whenever we do customer evaluation surveys, one of the key things that always comes out, one of the pet peeves, is just reliability of service. And reliability is not necessarily speed, but it's being able to know when the bus is coming, in our case, the buses, when the bus is coming, and being able to get that bus when the bus is supposed to be there. And actually get to your destination so the bus isn't breaking down, for example, right? So just being able to fix that reliability aspect, and that's an operational issue, a maintenance issue, a management issue, I think is important to be able to compete. And then the other thing for me is, really focusing where our competitive advantage is as well. We're viewed big, and not just here in Kingston, in other countries as well, is the same. The whole matter of safety and security. People tend to feel safer or more secure traveling mass transit sometimes than the smaller vehicles, the private vehicles. And especially like a Kingston that also has its fair history with, crime and violence, that becomes important. And so the focus needs to be placed there. Backtracking a bit in terms of reliability too is the matter of providing real-time information to customers. That's something that we don't do, and that's something that is definitely needed in 2023.
I agree.
If you're going to compete, in order to do for customers need to know where the buses are, and if a unit is coming on time, or it is running late, or if there's a detour, or if there's an adjustment to the the route or the schedule. So those are areas that definitely would need to be tightened up.
Agreed. And I want to kind of bring Carlos in, right? Because it's not that Medellin doesn't have taxis. It's not that Medellin doesn't have these minibuses. It has a lot of these too, right? So Carlos, could you kind of talk about how, as Carla mentioned, how these smaller transportation kind of fit in within the bigger picture, and kind of where are the bones of where the taxis and the minibuses ride, so that it doesn't become an obstacle to mass transit being efficient?
I mean, it's a huge challenge. What I'd like to start by saying that I hear you, I feel you, and it would be a lie to say that Medellin has solved every issue. Of course, that is not true. As Lorraine just said, in Medellin, additional systems and ways coexist with the more pretty picture that I shared with you today. But one of the issues that I think ought to be debated is that in this types of systems, incentives really make the difference. If, for example, if, for example, we were to provide space, road space, priority road space for mass transit as opposed to individual transport. Sorry about that, but she usually doesn't hear me speaking English. So, mi amor, estoy hablando y tengo que terminar. ¿Me dejas hablar, por favor? And that prioritizing road space makes the difference at the end, because users will prefer the mode that has the priority in direct line, for example. And I'd like to join that with one of the questions that we received via the chat that has to do with planning for the rich, planning for the poor. That is a fantastic question that cities around the world have been dealing with for decades. What I think is different in the case of Medellin is that, and I'm going to be extremely blunt about this, those living in low-income neighborhoods around the world also vote. And this means that there are mass majorities of people around the world, in our city, for example, that will prefer to be provided with fantastic mass transit systems if we can also communicate that in an intelligent way politically. I hope to be able to contribute to that debate respectfully, but I'd like to say that I'm completely against the fact that some people think that only if the rich demand high quality transport systems, cities will be providing them. I think it has to be decided in a completely different way.
Thank you for that. And I think that kind of encompasses one of the major problems here, right? The politics of doing the policies or the space allocation that will make mass transit work and make it efficient, right? That's a kind of a political thing, right? And I think in Jamaica, funny, as you mentioned it, Carlos, that, you know, when politicians are kind of campaigning, one of the things that they promise for people is roads, when the vast majority of Jamaicans do not own cars, right? They're not promising sidewalks, they're not promising more buses, they're promising roads, right? So I think there's sort of like a communication gap that's happening, that the thing I'm promising you is actually not for you, it's for 40% of the population. What you need is something I have no intentions of providing, right? So, and this kind of gets to one of the questions. I think Catherine had submitted this question for you, Carlos, like, how does politics affect your success as a transportation planning professional, right? And I think we can kind of expand that question to talk about politics in kind of advocating for transportation policy. Carlos, over to you.
Yeah, well, I think I feel completely, absolutely related to your sentence, Lorraine. I mean, most of the people, most of us humans that move around our cities in the global south, for example, Medellin, most of us do it either by walking, by cycling, or by the, I'm going to be respectful with this, but the terrible mass transport systems that we have. Most of us move around our cities like that. In Medellin, for example, even today, only 16% of our daily trips are done by car, which means that if you put it in terms of votes, that means that more than 80% of those who vote would definitely prefer to have better transport systems, such as those that we talked about today, but also better possibilities from the perspective of social inclusion, environmental inclusion, and socioeconomic justice. I'm going to leave it there.
Catherine, I see your hand up.
Yeah, an aspect of the problems or a challenge to solve any problems which has not been aired yet is the fact that us in the English-speaking Caribbean obviously are people who were colonized by the British. And I was reading an official government document from the 1960s or 70s recently as part of my PhD research. And in there, they actually say, not in these words, but they say the car is the future. The car is a symbol of social, upward progress. And England has so many percentage of cars, and we need to be the same to be seen as developed. And politicians, I didn't think of this when I asked the question to Carlos about politics and the impact on his success as a transport planning professional. But politicians come from the general population. We've all been programmed to have that mindset that a car represents a social, what's the word?
Status.
Yes, thank you. Your status is higher if you have a car and so forth. So I think that's something that majorly needs to be overcome, as well as reliability, because I'm not certain if any politician here in Trinidad and Tobago uses public transport as part of his or her day-to-day movements, where you find now Great Britain has progressed to such a point where a former mayor of London used to cycle to and from work. So clearly this society has gotten over that, that belief that the car or owning a car, it means that you're better than or you progress somewhat in life. Yeah.
Yeah. Carla,
So the
politician,
just to round it up, the politician himself needs to get, or herself needs to get out of that mindset. And I'm thinking that would help as well with their decision making as to how they spend on mass transit.
Carla?
Right. So again, quite agree with Catherine as it relates to this whole matter of status and the car being seen as a sign of affluence. Again, it goes to that whole socio-cultural, context of the Caribbean, and why I guess we continue to do developments in favor of the car. So we widen more roads, and I think some of this even came out of the last webinar that you did. Now, as it relates to politics affecting the role of the transportation planner, definitely does, and in very significant ways. And this is a transportation webinar, but it doesn't only affect transportation, it affects other areas as well. Because now you have a situation where the transport planner would rely on data and research and make recommendations based on research and data, but that never always coincides with the political agenda. Politicians often have different motives and ideas behind what they want to do, and typically their goal or their endpoint is often short term. It is often based on what can look good right now in the eyes of the public to attract votes for the next round of elections. Whereas the planner is focusing on what research is showing, what data is showing, and making recommendations for the longer term and for a more sustainable output ultimately. And so oftentimes you find a conflict there. And of course, planners are not the decision makers. So the planners make recommendations, but the decision making is going to be at government level. It is going to depend on the administration of the day. It might even depend on the minister within the administration of the day. And so because of that, you find the implementation of or projects or actions coming out very ad hoc and being very dependent on who is in charge at a given moment or point in time, as opposed to a long-term plan where successive persons actually, as they come in, they operationalize, aspects of an already set long-term plan. That doesn't really happen.
Yeah. So I want to acknowledge that there's a bunch of questions and comments in the chat, and I don't think we're going to get through all of them, but I'm going to read a chunk of them and then we kind of just respond in mass, right? So Rachel Goff, I hear Carla's point that there is no political will to support transit because the ridership is primarily the poor. I wonder also, would we in Jamaica be allowed to make the kind of investments in public transportation that Medellin did if, as we are under IMF agreement? So that's a math question, right? Like, does IMF allow us to make these type of investments? Is that kind of in line with their views of what development is? So that's one question. There's another question in here for Carlos by Catherine May, a kind of technical question. What is the minimum size city in terms of usership or ridership that can make a light rail metro system viable? So let's start with that one for you, Carlos. It's a technical question, it might be a little shorter than that big question, the other one.
All cities should consider and prioritize mass transit. I'd like to state that clearly. If the city is too small today, it will probably grow in the future. Therefore, as urban planners, we ought to consider that the sooner we forecast and plan ahead in the future, the better. Nonetheless, I understand the question, and usually tramways are preferred for cities and or neighborhoods and or regions where we have sufficient urban agglomeration. Cities around 250, 300,000 people already would probably have enough origin destination trips to make it feasible. Larger cities such as Medellin, which is about 4 million people, have the possibility of joining lines. With only one tramway line, Medellin could not be able to move around. That is only a line for a specific neighborhood.
Okay, got it. Carla, I'm not sure if you can answer this one, but I guess the question is kind of about our broader kind of socioeconomic conditions and the fact we're under multiple different IMF agreements. How does that impact our ability to invest in public transportation?
Right. So, I mean, that I'm not sure how the IMF agreements would actually affect that, but it was the big question in my head as Carlos presented, because the investment required in terms of the capital outlay for all of these modes that were presented that exist in Medellin. My first thought was, how would that funding work for us? We in Kingston, we have a bus company, so we have the urban buses. We've I don't want to offend anybody by I was thinking, should I say toyed or struggled with the rail, the idea of rail. But of course, that has been a very costly venture for us because we're still using a rail system that existed many years ago. It's by nowhere, no shape or form near modern. And so it comes with very high costs. But we've from time to time explored using these trains for moving passengers. But a lot, if we were to make the type of changes that we're seeing in Colombia, it would require a huge capital outlay. When again, it goes back to the whole point of our priorities, because as it relates to our buses, oftentimes, the JUTC is considered a drain on the public purse. That's
Yeah.
how it's viewed by some, you know, facets of government.
Yeah.
And if that can be seen that way, then we'll be willing to, you know, fork out the billions that would be required to make any further investment anywhere else. Because
Yeah.
for the other modes now, you're not just thinking about the vehicles themselves, you're thinking about the lines. If you're talking about tram lines, if you're talking about train lines, you're talking about developing or redeveloping, because we do have tram lines in parts of the city that existed when, you know, those would need to be rehabilitated and so on.
I just wanted to jump in there. So Rebecca is saying that we're not currently under an IMF agreement, which is true, but we've been on the other ones previously. And I just want to kind of make a point or connection between what you just said about how JUTC is viewed as a drain on the kind of public purse. But while we're widening roads, that is a decade-long maintenance drain as well that we never really think about, right? So I know that we're approaching the end of the webinar, but if you would like to stay for a couple more questions, please do so. We have a question here from Dion, which I think is very much related to what we're talking about. And I think it's for both Carla and Catherine, right? The financial productivity of cities are often linked to the connectivity of its people. In terms of making an economic case for investing in public transportation, are there endeavors to make economic case kind of based on this principle? So the same thing, you know, Carlos was talking about, investing in public transportation and bringing lower income communities, having them have much easier opportunities to kind of access resources in the city. That's an economic story, right? That's a socially transformative story. So could you kind of talk about the potential of, I guess, rebranding public transportation in those terms?
That was me or Carlos?
Yeah.
Either, whoever wants to go first.
Okay, I'll go first. I think another part of improving our capabilities as transportation planners in, I guess, the global south or in developing countries is to broaden our minds about who is worthy of access to transport and who is not. Of course, people's incomes do affect their modes of travel, but I think that it's not helpful for us to continue to think about planning for the poor and planning for the rich. I'll tell you why. Give another example, which is not specific to Port of Spain, but is relevant to the topic at hand. The bus journey that I talked about from Port of Spain to Arima or along the priority bus route. If we take the government bus, it's $2.50. To take a maxi taxi, which is a 25-seater bus, for those who don't know, it's $10. And in any currency, that's a huge difference between $2.50 and $10. And yet people are, and of course, there's people who drive their cars to that same origin and destination as well. There's poor people who have to forced to spend the $2 and the $10 or use their car. You see what I mean? So it's not really the provision of transport is not really so much. I mean, it does link to income and people's affordability and poverty and things like that, but reliability and comfort are much more important, where that, getting that shift from the cars to public transport use. Of course, the mindset I mentioned as well, that's much more important. That's much more important. And one other thing here as well, people, when they travel overseas, a lot of people tend to use public transport, whereas here they won't ever. And again, I of course have a means of quantifying that for overseas, but I'm almost certain it's related to reliability. Definitely. Yeah. Comfort is because comfort is relative, but to me that should be more of the focus.
I see Carlos is hand up.
Yeah, Dorena, I wanted to say that I know we ran out of time, but I'm surprised with the amount of questions that we got in the chat there. It's incredible. I mean, there's no way to answer all of them, but I thank you and I thank everybody for the questions, and what a great discussion. Maybe next time both Catherine and Carla ought to provide a presentation, because I think there's much left there to thread about. But in general, I would say the following: good quality public transport, mass transit, and possibilities for walking and cycling will always be cheaper in the long term. They will always be cheaper in the long term. And that not only refers to the user, but also to the city. And they will always be cheaper in the long term, both in economic, social, and environmental terms. This from a very, spreadsheet type analysis from the perspective of the common goods and the health of the city and planetary health, for that matter. So I saw there were many questions referring to costs, and there was a particular question, for example, about the public bike scheme in Medellin. I would summarize this by saying good service from the mass transit, public transport, and else perspectives will always be cheaper in the long term. And yes, there are possibilities such as public-private partnerships or possibilities from the perspective that the government will be able to provide the initial funding for a system that is sustainable in the longer term. I'm very surprised and thankful for having had the opportunity to share with you today.
Thank you so much. I think we're gonna probably end on that note. Like, there was a lot more questions than we anticipated, and we obviously didn't get to go through all of them. But I think the kind of key conversation here, understanding that Medellin is a much bigger city than all of our countries probably combined, right? But the idea here is that mass transit is important and it's integral to any sort of transformation that we want to see in our cities. And that there are bits and pieces that we can scale down for our context here in the Caribbean from Medellin's story, and in fact from lots of other cities in the global south's story, right? It's I think at least the point from Island City Lab is that we're kind of ambivalent to the type of technology that we use, but just understanding that there needs to be a choice to put mass transit first, right? And with that, I really want to thank Carla. I really want to thank Catherine and Carlos for spending time prepping and joining this conversation, and really making a very interesting discussion. All of our events are recorded and they're going to be posted to the Island City Lab YouTube page. And lastly, we have 2 more conversations coming up in the Mobilize series. So please look out for marketing coming out in the next few weeks for upcoming conversations. The next one is going to be September 14th, and that's going to be all about active transit, which I think we kind of preempt in this conversation. So that's both cycling and pedestrianization. And we're talking to a transportation planner from Nairobi, Kenya, about their case study there. And then the last one is going to be in October 17th, talking about tactical urbanism. So how do we begin to sort of pilot and experiment and test a couple of these ideas in our cities now, instead of waiting until a big load comes available, right? So please stay on the lookout for more and upcoming events and publications from Island City Lab. I want to thank you all for joining, and everyone in the chat who participated. Thank you guys so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.